Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about playing games. Now, probably one of the most frequent questions or question types I get on this channel is people want to know what games I've played, or have I played a particular game, or will I play a particular game and live stream it, or have I played a particular mod, or have I played a particular tabletop game and what I think of it. And I understand why people are asking me that. You've played it and you either really like it or really hate it for some of you, and you want to talk about it, and I get that. But the primary goal of this channel, as I've said multiple times, is I want to talk about what game development is like and what my experience with game development is like, in case you're thinking about going into game development or you're in game development. Because there are just a lot of issues that arise and you find yourself second guessing yourself. You think you're alone in all this. And I want to point out you're not. I've had some of the same doubts, some of the same issues. But I get still why people keep asking me, well, what about this game? What about this game? Because it's relevant to what we're talking about. And I did an entire video on why I will not review games. You may want to check it. It's the link below. And one of the reasons I just want to remind you is it's the same reason I don't like talking too much about current industry events, is when I'm done with this channel, and I don't know when that's going to be. Hopefully it's years away. I want it to be timeless. I don't want it to be filled with things where people are like, oh my God, he's talking about that game that's 20 years old. I mean, when I talked about my favorite games of all times, people were saying, well, these games are really old. And I'm like, yeah, they're my favorite games of all time, not last week. The other reason I don't review games is I did a video with my favorite chocolate. And in that video, I linked to my chocolate website, which has a review of every chocolate I've eaten since 1993. Not only are they in there by brand and name of the chocolate, but you can also search by country, by year, by what type of chocolate it is, dark, white, rose. You can also search whether or not this is something that I got as a gift or I bought or whatever. So there's a million ways to search, but there's a search bar right at the top that you can just go, like, you can type in the name of the chocolate and see all the reviews I have. Despite that, I still got asked repeatedly in that video, well, have you had this bar? How about this one? What do you think of this? And I'm like, I started answering some of them by going to my site, finding the review, and posting the link. After a while, I stopped doing that. I literally could not keep up. So there's no doubt in my mind, based on that video, that even if I started to review games, that would be a never-ending task. It would never, that's all I would do, is play games and review them. And it would be filled with, why don't you play this game? What about this one? What about that one? So I decided on this video to talk about playing games in general. I want to talk about just that. I mean, it's obvious that you guys play games, or you probably wouldn't be here. Although some of you said you don't play games and you still like being here anyway, and that's cool. But what I want to talk about is playing games in general. If your goal is to play every game that has come out, I don't think anybody has that anymore. It is impossible. I think people have shown that you literally can't play every game on Steam, because the number of Steam games out there, the number of hours estimated to play them, is longer than the average person's lifetime. And that's if you never slept or ate or worked and you just sat at your computer and played games all day, which sounds like awesome. But anyway, you still couldn't do it. And that is discounting the fact that new games are constantly being put into the Steam library. So then some of you go, well, I'll just play every game in a genre. Like, I'll play every role-playing game. Still can't do that. There are just so many games coming out, even in a particular genre. So some of you may go, well, I'll play every AAA or every indie game. You still can't do that. It's gotten that big. The industry is that big. You just have to accept that you're not going to play every game. You don't have the time, but you can't discover it. I did a whole video on discoverability, on why it's really hard to find games anymore. Games for you. And I'm talking, when I say good games, I do mean good games for you. I did a whole video on, what bad games are. But it's all subjective to you. So when you're trying to find something that's good for you, there's just so much out there, and it's hard to discover them. And not only that, but besides Steam, there are other storefronts, and they're all jammed to the gills with games. Part of the problem is with all these free game engines, everyone's making games. So I want to talk about how that idea of you needing to play these games, maybe before you feel like you can talk about them intelligently online, you need to play a ton of them, or if you're like me and you want to be a game developer, well, if you're like me 40 years ago, you may fall into the trap of saying, well, I can't make any game in this genre until I play them all. This is a complete trap. When I went to grad school in 1987 at University of California, Irvine, they told us that you'll probably get your PhD in 5 years. A few people did it in 4. There were these prodigies that did it in 3. But if you're coming in, especially like I did, with a bachelor's degree, you're expected to earn a master's in a year and a half or 2 years, which I did, and then continue on for another 3 years to get your PhD. After another 2 years, I gave up. But I want to point out that just like people who think they have to play every game, there were several graduate students in my department, information and computer science, who had been there for 6, 7, 8 years. And that kind of scared me because I did not want to still be there. I was 21. I think I turned 22 right after I got to UCI. I did not want to be at UCI working on my PhD when I was in my 30s. I either wanted to be a professor or maybe go back into games, which I did. When I talked to some of those PhD candidates, which some of the people in my cohort, that were the people who came in my year, and sometimes the year before and after, they were considered like the cohort. This is like the group that similar background, similar training, similar educational training. Some of them disparagingly called those grad students who had been there for 8 or 9 years lifers. And I was like, no, I'm sure they're working on something good, and maybe it's what happened to me where they picked a topic and then it got done by someone else. But it turned out several of them had this block, this mental block, that they felt like they needed to read all the papers in their area before they could finish their thesis. And the problem with that is not only were there a ton of papers in their area, but there were constantly new ones coming out. You literally could not put a pin in it and go, okay, now I'm going to write my thesis. Because while you're writing your thesis, more more white papers and conference papers and other PhD theses are going to come out. The same thing happens in gaming. You may think, I'm not going to make a game until I've played all of them, or most of them, or the majority of the high-reviewed ones. But you can't do that. You can't wait, because while you're waiting, new ones will come out. In fact, once you start to make a game, new ones are going to come out. And it's very hard to not be swayed by them, because a new one will come out, it's the new hotness. Everyone's like, ooh, you got to have multiplayer, you got to have microtransactions, you got to have this kind of game feature. And you're like, oh, I didn't design for that. Well, if you keep getting swayed by the new hotness of everything coming out, you're never going to finish your game, which I think happens. The other thing I want to remind people is there are people out there who make reviewing games their jobs. That's what they do 100% of the time. I like watching Mortismal Gaming because Mortem has made it 100% his job. He 100% games, which I like, but it's all he does. That's his job. He does it full time. And he still doesn't 100% every game coming out, or every RPG, or every AAA RPG. There are just too many. And there's also a ton that came out decades ago that I don't think he's ever going to get to. But there's another thing to think about here. I like Mortem. I like a lot of critics out there, but critics don't necessarily make good game directors. In fact, I'd say that those are two very different skill sets, and the Venn diagram of good critic and good game director is a very thin overlap. So your idea of I'm going to have to play every game and get a good idea of what all these games have is flawed from the start. Not only you're not going to be able to do it, even if you could, playing all those games won't guarantee you're going to be a good game director. In fact, I think I better make a video about taste, but I better make that a Fun Friday one, because subjectivity is subjective. But anyway, so my TLDR. Play games. Play games to enjoy them. Play games to learn things. Do not pretend for a moment that you're going to play all the games that are out there, or all of them in a genre, or even a subcategory of a particular genre. And if that's what's holding you back from making a game, or starting your game, or finishing a game that you've already started, understand that you've fallen into a trap and you just need to ignore it. Make your game. Eventually, people will grow. If you have a really good, like your own flavor, people want your game, not a game that looks like it has features pulled in from something else. So that's my advice. Play games, but don't be trapped by the idea that you have to play all of them.